While the world watches Ukraine, Russia is quietly building an empire in America's backyard. Over 300 Russian military personnel are now stationed across Latin America. Chinese and Russian warships conduct joint exercises just miles from U.S. shores, and most Americans have no idea this is happening. What you're about to discover will change how you see the global chessboard forever. I'm bringing you the facts the mainstream media won't cover. If you want real geopolitical analysis, hit that subscribe button for RedLine USA. Let's get into it. For over a century, Latin America has been considered America's sphere of influence. The Monroe Doctrine of 1823 essentially declared the Western Hemisphere off limits. But that era is over. Russia isn't just testing the waters in Latin America. They're building a permanent presence. Since 2015, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has made over a dozen trips to Latin America. Putin himself has hosted more than 20 Latin American leaders in Moscow. These aren't courtesy visits. These are strategic partnerships. Russian military equipment now flows into Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba. Energy deals worth billions are being signed. And here's what should terrify Washington. China is partnering with Russia, creating a Beijing-Moscow axis in the Americas. The question isn't whether Russia is making moves in Latin America. The question is, why now? And what does this mean for the future of American security? Let's start with the crown jewel of Russia's Latin American strategy, Venezuela. Venezuela isn't just another ally for Moscow, it's a strategic goldmine. With the world's largest proven oil reserves, Venezuela represents an economic lifeline for Russia at a time when Western sanctions are squeezing Moscow's economy. Since 2005, Russia has sold over $5 billion in weapons to Venezuela. We're talking Su-30 fighter jets, T-72 tanks, S-300 air defense systems. And it's not just equipment. Hundreds of Russian military advisors are currently in Venezuela, training troops and maintaining these sophisticated weapon systems. In December 2018, two Russian Tu-160 strategic bombers, nuclear-capable aircraft, landed in Venezuela in a clear message to Washington. Think about Venezuela's location. It sits at the northern tip of South America, with direct access to the Caribbean and proximity to the Panama Canal. But Russia's support for the Maduro regime goes deeper. When the U.S. recognized Juan Guaido, Russia stood firm with Maduro, sending military contractors and financial support. Russia has extended over $17 billion in loans. Much of this debt is repaid in oil, giving Moscow a steady revenue stream and a foothold in global energy markets. In 2023 and 2024, joint Russian-Venezuelan military exercises became routine. Russian warships regularly dock in Venezuelan ports. The message to Washington is clear. If you can support NATO expansion to Russia's borders, Russia can build partnerships in your backyard. If Venezuela is Russia's economic anchor in Latin America, then Cuba and Nicaragua are its military outposts, and what we're seeing is nothing short of a Cold War revival. Remember the Soviet listening station at Lourdes, Cuba? During the Cold War, this facility was Moscow's eyes and ears on the United States. It was shut down in 2001. Well, it's back. In 2014, Russia quietly began upgrading intelligence facilities in Cuba. By 2023, U.S. intelligence confirmed that Russia is operating at least one signals intelligence site on the island. From Cuba, Russian intelligence can intercept military communications from U.S. Southern Command, track naval movements, and monitor satellites, just 90 miles from Florida. And it's not just intelligence. Russian warships have made over 15 port visits to Cuba since 2013. In June 2024, a Russian nuclear-powered submarine docked in Havana Harbor. Russia has also stepped in to fill the economic void. Moscow supplies oil to Cuba, provides technical assistance for the power grid, and has written off billions in Soviet-era debt. Now let's talk about Nicaragua, because this is where things get even more interesting. Daniel Ortega, Nicaragua's authoritarian leader, has become one of Russia's most reliable allies in the region. Since returning to power, he has aligned Nicaragua with Moscow. Russia has supplied tanks and helicopters, but the real game changer is Nicaragua's offer to host Russian military bases, authorizing troops and ships for training. Look at where Nicaragua sits, between the Caribbean and Pacific. This is about Russia establishing a permanent foothold that could threaten maritime traffic. There's also the Nicaragua Canal Project, a Chinese-backed initiative to build a rival to the Panama Canal. Russian involvement would give Moscow influence over global shipping. When Ortega violently suppressed protests in 2018, Russia provided unwavering support. While the West condemned the violence, Moscow saw an opportunity. This is strategic encirclement. Russia is building a network of allied states that can host military assets and complicate any US military response in the region. But Russia's strategy in Latin America isn't just military, it's economic. And that's where the real, long-term influence is built. Take Argentina. Russia's state nuclear company, Rosatom, is involved in extending the life of Argentina's nuclear power plants. These are billions of dollars in contracts. Brazil, the economic powerhouse of Latin America, presents an even more complex picture. Russia's real play here is energy and technology. Russia's state oil company has invested in Brazilian offshore oil projects. Russian expertise in Arctic drilling translates well to these deep-water reserves. And then there's BRICS. This economic bloc represents Russia's vision for a multipolar world order that challenges Western dominance. BRICS nations are actively working to reduce dependence on the US dollar. Russia and Brazil have discussed settling trade in local currencies, bypassing the dollar entirely. Moscow has expanded its diplomatic presence across the continent. This isn't random. This is a coordinated strategy to build influence across every country in Latin America. Now here's where the situation becomes truly dangerous for the West. Russia isn't acting alone in Latin America. China and Russia are coordinating their expansion. China's Belt and Road Initiative has poured over $150 billion into infrastructure. Russia brings military cooperation. Together, they offer an alternative to Western partnership. China now controls or has stakes in over 40 ports across Latin America. These aren't just commercial ventures, they're dual-use facilities that could support military operations. In 2024, we saw Russian naval vessels using Chinese-controlled port facilities. This is coordination in action. China builds the infrastructure. Russia uses it for power projection. China's Huawei has become the dominant provider of 5G infrastructure. Russia's cyber capabilities complement this, creating potential vulnerabilities in critical communications. Look at UN voting patterns. Countries receiving Chinese and Russian investment increasingly vote with Beijing and Moscow on key resolutions. This is what the new Cold War looks like. It's not about ideology. It's about power, influence, and access to resources. And right now, the China-Russia axis is winning. Now let's connect the dots to Ukraine. Russia's moves in Latin America are directly linked to the war in Eastern Europe. Here's something chilling. Some of the same weapon systems Russia is using in Ukraine are now being delivered to Latin America. Europe's energy crisis showed how dependencies can be weaponized. Russia is now creating similar dependencies in Latin America, giving Moscow leverage. The war in Ukraine has shown us that geography matters less in modern conflict. Russia doesn't need to be physically close to threaten Western interests. If Russia can successfully establish a permanent presence in Latin America, it changes the entire strategic calculus for the United States. Russia's moves in Latin America aren't just interesting geopolitics, they're a direct challenge to American security. The question is, are we paying attention? Russia's moves in Latin America aren't just interesting geopolitics, they're a direct challenge to American security and prosperity. The question is, are we paying attention? Well, the Pentagon is, and what they're doing about it will shock you. While Russia was building its network in Latin America, the United States wasn't sleeping. Deep inside the Pentagon, American strategists have been preparing a response, and it's already underway. Welcome back to RedLine USA. I'm bringing you the counter-strategy that the mainstream media isn't covering. This is part 2 of our Russia in Latin America series. If you haven't watched part 1, check the link. Now, let's look at the silent response. Here's what most people don't realize. While Russia was making headlines, the US was activating a massive counter-strategy. It starts with Southcom. Operation Resolute Sentinel. Joint exercises with Colombia involving over 3,000 troops. Colombia is our strongest ally, and we're ensuring they stay equipped. Enhanced freedom of navigation operations in the Caribbean, monitoring every Russian vessel that enters the region. We're tracking everything. Cyber command operations are actively disrupting Russian propaganda, and intelligence sharing with Brazil, Argentina, and Chile means we're listening to every move. But it's not just military. The America's Partnership for Economic Prosperity commits billions to infrastructure and tech. We're offering a transparent alternative to Russian money. But let's be brutally honest about where America is falling short, because this is where the real danger lies. According to recent polls, American favorability in Latin America has been declining. In countries like Mexico and Brazil, more people view China favorably than the US. Why? Decades of inconsistent policy, supporting authoritarian regimes when it suited us, then abandoning them. That creates resentment. Our immigration policies have created tension. While we need security, the rhetoric has damaged relationships with the very allies we need against Russian influence. We failed to deliver on economic promises. We pulled out of trade partnerships, while China stepped in with the Belt and Road Initiative. Between 2017 and 2021, the U.S. Secretary of State made fewer than 10 trips to the region. Russia's Lavrov made over 25. Showing up matters. Our Venezuela policy has been inconsistent. Russia backed Maduro with cash and weapons, and he is still in power. That makes the U.S. look weak. We have limited engagement with Nicaragua and Cuba. This creates a vacuum that Russia fills easily. You can't influence countries you won't talk to. While Russia establishes footholds, the U.S. has actually closed bases. We have fewer permanent installations now than during the Cold War. So, when Russia and China show up with deals and no lectures, leaders ask, why stay loyal to the U.S.? That's the question keeping strategists awake at night. But here's where the story takes a turn, because in 2023, the Pentagon activated something that most Americans don't know exists. Its classified designation is Operation Hemisphere Shield, and it represents the most aggressive U.S. counter-strategy in Latin America in half a century. The United States is establishing a network of what they call lily pad bases, small, flexible military outposts. These aren't massive installations. These are rapid response positions. Confirmed locations include expanded facilities in Colombia, Peru, Paraguay, and Panama. Unconfirmed but likely positions in Guyana, Honduras, and potentially Argentina. Space Force is now providing real-time satellite surveillance of every Russian and Chinese military asset in Latin America. Nothing happens without U.S. intelligence knowing. Cyber Command has been authorized to conduct offensive operations. We're not just defending, we're attacking their command and control systems. The Treasury Department has prepared financial weapons of mass destruction, targeted sanctions that can completely freeze Russian economic activity. Special Operations Command has embedded advisors in over a dozen Latin American militaries, building relationships and gathering information. The State Department has launched the Americas Technology Partnership, providing alternatives to Chinese 5G networks and Russian cybersecurity systems. And there's been a massive diplomatic surge. We're rebuilding relationships one meeting at a time. The strategy is clear: surround, cut off, monitor, and provide better alternatives. So where does this all lead? Let's talk about the three most likely scenarios for the next decade. Scenario 1. Managed competition. The United States and Russia settle into a pattern of managed competition. Scenario 2. Russian retreat. Economic pressure and better U.S. diplomacy force Russia to scale back its ambitions. Scenario 3. Escalation and crisis. This is the nightmare scenario. A Russian military provocation forces a U.S. response. Here's what you need to understand. Whatever happens in Latin America affects every American. Your tax dollars, jobs, and grocery costs. This is the reality. Russia has made significant moves, but the United States is fighting back with everything we've got. The battle for influence is happening right now. You won't get this analysis anywhere else. That's why RedLine USA exists. Hit that subscribe button right now. Ring that notification bell. Drop a comment. Do you think the US response is strong enough? I want to hear your strategic thinking. Coming up next, China's master plan to dominate the Pacific and why Taiwan is just the beginning. You need to see this. This is RedLine USA. Stay informed, stay vigilant, stay ahead. We'll see you in the next one.